Welcome to week 6, everyone. I am really delighted with the conversation that we've had this past week with one another. I especially appreciate the growing sensibility, I think, evident in the responses, sensibility of following the sort of rhetorical thrust of Paul's argument, and maybe realizing that sometimes this is just very difficult. As several of you emphasize in your responses, Paul doesn't always finish the sentences that he starts. It's a famous philosopher that wrote an essay on Paul several hundred years ago and described him as a man beset by a crowd of thoughts, all clamoring at the same time for utterance. And I think that is a eloquent way of sort of capturing what seems to be the hive mind of the Apostle Paul. And we see that coming out in these now really dense sections of the letter where there's a whole bunch of relevant terms, issues that are crashing into the same paragraph. So, God bless you as you try to sort through that. And I thank you for receiving my expositions charitably as I'm trying to do what I can to clarify the flow of Paul's thought. And I hope to call us back again and again to the bodily currency of what Paul is saying, so that we don't allow the meaning of this language to drift to some supposedly separate theoretical space, but to interpret it as commentary on the bodily dynamics of our life in virtue of the history that our bodies have inherited and that we are together, as well as the future, the hope that our bodily life already anticipates today. That, I think, is the kind of nexus in which we want to interpret a letter like Romans, which has so often been rendered, I think, kind of sterile, perhaps, or overly academic by the way that its meaning has been consigned to some separate realm of theory about God, as opposed to being Paul's way of telling the story of who we are and how we live and what God has enabled in our life through Christ by the Spirit. Couple things that I want to highlight from this past week's discussions specifically. The first one is keeping in mind that what Paul has said about the law, specifically in 5:12 to 21, is addressed to people for whom he has specific concerns, people that manifest a certain tendency. And it's in response to that tendency, perhaps to exaggerate the power of the law or to boast in having the law, that Paul talks about the inability of the law to enact justice on its own, and in fact, the ability instead of the law to witness to the power of sin and therefore to the mercy of God, but consequently not to be a basis for boasting. Now, if you sort of stood back and without a lot of care simply construed what Paul says here as his general statement about the law, then you could come away with a very negative impression about the law that I think is not really true to Paul's teaching in the rest of this letter or in other letters, but is simply a kind of rushed generalization of what he says in this one place, and in a way that doesn't really pay attention to what his particular rhetorical purposes are there. So just remember that Paul does not, in fact, have a generally negative view of the law, but he is concerned that his readers, including us, learn how to use the law so that it can serve the embodiment of justice by the power of Jesus, as opposed to using the law in a way that aggravates our plight or further estranges us from one another by functioning as a basis of self-righteous judgment. So that's the first kind of
I'm worried about
comment I
your
wanted to
surfboard
make in response to
over
this
there
past week's discussions. And the other
because
one is, I
Jackson will
think,
break
just
things.
to acknowledge an oversight of mine in the podcast exposition of this past week's segment, 512 to 623, especially 6:1 to 23, because Paul introduces, as he has with so many other big terms in Romans, the term of baptism without any background, without any kind of uh, commentary on its significance. He simply assumes that his audience knows what is involved in baptism and what its implications are. And so I didn't pause, I think, as I should have, to clarify that what Paul's use of baptism tells us, his presenting our dying and rising with Christ in terms of baptism, is that we participate in the power of Christ's death and resurrection in community. Baptism is a communal ritual. It is a way by which members are welcomed into the community, and the members of the community continually understand the nature and the dynamics of their life together, a life of dying and rising in conformity with the pattern of the Messiah. Uh, if we don't remember or keep in mind the ecclesial or the communal nature of this institution of baptism, then I think we'll be apt to claim for people some power of Christ's death and resurrection independently of a shared life and community, which is in fact necessary, I think, in Paul's presentation for the sort of transformation that he's describing. So, just a reminder that baptism implies community. It implies specifically church community, not as an ideal where the right thing always happens, but as the place where we gather in Jesus' name and learn to die and rise together. Because learning to die and to be raised is not something that we can, in fact, do alone. It's something that requires giving and receiving with others. Now, looking ahead this coming week, first of all, just to note that I am aware that you're facing a heavy week when it comes to the difficulty of the segment of Romans that we're studying together, and the work that you're required to do this week. So I've tried to alleviate the burden a little bit, you'll notice, in response form one, by telling you that you don't, in fact, have to interact with your commentaries this week, although I hope you'll at least dip into them at certain points. We won't require that that be part of your response in response forum one. And I've invited you to complete the reading of the other secondary material in conjunction with your study of the text of Romans 7:1 to 8:17, so that you can both work with the interpretive questions that I've put to you about that section of the letter at the same time that you're reflecting on those secondary voices. And the second response forum will be devoted simply to a response to the podcast exposition. You can, of course, include reflections on other secondary material if you'd like, but really just asking you to give me some reaction to that podcast exposition. And once again, you can do that in the form of something in writing, or if you prefer, you can record a substantive 3 to 5 minute video of your response to that exposition of Romans 7:1 to 8:17. This is the week in which you'll be submitting a first draft of your interpretive working paper for peer review. So, this is not going to be your final draft of this first formal assignment, but your rough draft, you might say. It needs to be a complete draft, however, so that your partner will have a complete paper to read, to review, and to give you suggestions about. What you're going to receive from me, if you haven't seen it already, is a Google Doc that is has your name for the name of the document, and is where you're going to uh, paste the text of your interpretive working paper. That's all you need to do by uh, Monday at the end of this week 6, is to post, or to paste rather, the text of your interpretive working paper onto that Google Doc. Then next week, you'll receive from me on Monday evening your partner assignment, and both your partner and yourself will have access to one another's Google Docs of your interpretive working papers, and then be able to complete the review according to the instructions that I'll give you for that review next week. So, just so you know, the only way that you need to submit your rough draft of your interpretive working paper this week is by pasting the text of your complete paper onto the Google Doc that I have shared with you for the interpretive working paper. I think you'll find that the texts that we have coming up this week are especially challenging, but I hope, and I actually expect, in light of what I've seen already of your written work the past couple weeks, that you're going to be able to read the thread of the letter with new insight, to be able to grasp some of what Paul is saying with some fresh eyes, because you've been developing this sensitivity to the rhetorical flow of Paul's argument. So I hope that you'll find the study not just to be difficult, but enlightening as you apply some of the skills that you've been developing in our class. The segment is, of course, just ripe for all kinds of theological and pastoral reflection, sort of teasing out of how this puts words to the life that we share together today. And of course, that will be welcome in what you contribute to our forum discussions. But as I've, I think, said in previous weeks, when we come across terms, categories that have been so typical of systematic theology in the Christian tradition, it's especially important for us to try to slow down our reading and to track with the way in which the thread of Paul's letter is using these terms, as opposed to simply bringing immediately on board a lot of the platitudes, sort of superficial or cliche ideas that these big terms often trigger in our minds. So do your best to try to discipline the mobilization of those big theological terms in your mind by attending to the way that Paul is using them and actually developing their meaning in the course of this argument. The movement from 7:1 to 8:17, I think, is a kind of singular movement, a movement from death to life. Life not as an escape from death, but life as a certain way of dying. Life not as a way of putting the law aside, but in fact fulfilling the law's purpose, and doing this in a way that is as scandalous and counterintuitive as the crucifixion of the final king of Israel. That is at the heart of Paul's gospel. It's at the heart of our own hope. And as we'll see, it's at the heart of the possibility for a rich hospitality and shared life in God's kingdom as the community of the baptized participating in Christ's death and resurrection. Looking forward to your responses, and I'm grateful for the hard work that has been so evident from you as a class these past weeks. So God bless you in your study this week.